and with the opening prayer. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Picking up from the earlier class, a little more about the structure of the text called Panchadashi, and leading right up to the chapter at hand that we are going to be studying. The Panchadashi is divided into 3 sections, each one a quintad of 5 chapters. And the first 5 chapters end with the word Viveka. Tattva Viveka, Panchakosha Viveka, Mahavakya Viveka, like that. And then the second set of 5, they have the word Deepa. Tripti Deepa, Chitra Deepa, Nataka Deepa, Kutastha Deepa, etc. Just a elegant way of naming the chapter. And then the last 5 have Ananda, Vidyananda, Vishayananda, like that. Brahmananda, all these things, and so there is this is the structure, and it is, I think, modeled somewhat on the Bhagavad Gita, which has a similar structure in the sense that the first 5 chapters, they deal with the Jagat, the manifest universe, and the individual's placement in the manifest universe. Same thing in the Bhagavad Gita also. It begins with Arjuna's cries, complaints, wailings, resistance to the concept of what needs to be done. And it deals with that because that's where the problem is. Brahman has no problem. And in fact, even the body doesn't have a problem. Whatever you feed it, it keeps on eating. That's not the problem. The problem is centered on the ahankara, centered exactly on the ahankara, the I notion, which identifies with everything finite, which has a penchant for that, and suffers as a result of that. And so, now the first 5 chapters talk about the placement of the individual within the scheme of things. What is the, what are the 5 elements, and the body is also part of the 5 elements. And then, the Srishti, the Jagat is Ishvara's manifestation. This is made very clear in the first half. Jagat is Ishvara's manifestation. And then what? And then, so what? So, what about you? What does that mean for you? The individual. Well, the individual is not happy as long as the individual jiva is a human being, okay? The individual jiva is not happy living in the Jagat made by Ishvara, manifested by Ishvara, projected by Ishvara. So what does the individual do? The individual tries to tweak the Jagat based on one's raga and dvesha. I want little more of this, little less of this, I want this. So there is the Atma Ajnanam that we talked about yesterday. What is that? The Ajnanam centered on the I. Ajnanam means ignorance, self-ignorance. So the self-ignorance makes the Jagat a very difficult place to live, because the Jagat enters the buddhi through the sense organs. The Jagat enters one through the buddhi, through the sense organs. The Jagat is assimilated, but based on and affected by one's own infrastructure, raga, dvesha, etc., etc., etc. This is what the problem is. And based on one's own raga dvesha, one takes on the Jagat and thinks about the Jagat in certain ways. And this is what is talked about in the first 5 chapters of how to be in a place of objectivity with regard to the scheme of things in order to assimilate this knowledge. And the middle 5 chapters have to do with the analysis, a deep analysis of this Atma Jnanam, and how this Jnanam completely transforms the individual jiva from being a complaining person to first being a person who is at peace with what there is in the universe, and then being one with what is. And what is Ishvara. So this is the content of the middle 5 chapters, and the last 5 chapters talk about the results of this knowledge. Because after all, the human mind is very much pragmatic and utilitarian. Everyone wants to know before getting into anything, इसमें मुझे क्या मिलेगा? What will I get out of this? This is a common question. You ask somebody, do this. Well, yeah, but sure, I'll do this, but what will I get out of this? And so that the results of the knowledge, which is even emphasized in the Upanishads, what happens if you do this? The Upanishads also says you will be free of sorrow, you will be free of fear, you will be free, in other words, of samsara. Upanishad also tells, and so this one also tells this. You will be free completely of all kinds of things. That, anartha vratan visharati, all the complaints are put to rest. Not by changing what the Jagat is like, but by shifting cognitively your own view of yourself, the Jagat, and the Lord, and the Goddess, so that you understand that everything is one. So this is the structure of the whole Panchadashi. And so we land on the last chapter. Why not do the first chapter? Why do the last chapter? Because we can fit it in these in the number of days we have. That is why we choose the last chapter. And as I said, the Panchadashi has this way of appealing to everybody. It has a universal appeal, and each chapter is crafted so well that it has got a stand-alone status. But yet, it is part of a whole text which has its commitment to self-knowledge and freedom from samsara. And I hope you have downloaded the text. If not, perhaps somebody can share it in the chat pod as an attachment. Perhaps somebody can be kind enough to do that. And so since it's a whole text, the text itself begins with a prayer. This is a very important thing, because we are told traditionally, do not study a text that has no prayer. There is an injunction. Do not study a text that does not begin with a prayer. This is the primary reason why no one has heard of the tenets, I don't know what it was even called, but a book on dharma, book on the tenets of dharma, written by none other than Duryodhana. Did you even know that Duryodhana, the villain of the Mahabharata, wrote a book on dharma? Oh, I didn't know that. Why? Because he did not walk the talk, first thing, and then secondly, he did not begin with the prayer. And that book was immediately discarded, fed to the goats, because the books were in the form of manuscripts, tasty manuscripts from the standpoint of the goats. So that was all fed to the goats. And so there is this injunction in the Shastra, an unwritten rule, but something that is taken very seriously, because you are not the author of this knowledge. It has come from Bhagavan, and therefore this is not something to be taken as there is no ascription of agency. And so whatever you learn from Bhagavan and the Guru combined. And so all the works that are worth studying begin with the prayer. The prayer, of course, when we talk about stalwart and illustrious authors in the tradition, like Adi Shankara, etc., even Panini, they have they have such mastery, such great mastery, that their prayer is sometimes put in a covert way, very covert way, so that it is not like the prayer to the Panchadashi or the prayer to the Tattva Bodha, Atma Bodha. All of these have a couplet or two talking about why this book should be read, and then talking about who this book is for, who this shloka is for, who this work is for, and ascribing the knowledge to God and Bhagavan. Bhagavan and Guru. Sometimes, in the case of masters like Adi Shankara, the prayer is a covert nod to Bhagavan, like in the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita doesn't begin with the prayer, and in fact the Purva Pakshis, the people who are objecting to this tradition, and our sparring partners, sometimes they come up with the objection, the Gita must not be studied because Bhagavan Vyasa did not have a prayer. But what about all the dhyana shlokas? Dhyana shlokas were later on added. They are not actually prayer, so it should not be studied. Well, how does the Bhagavad Gita begin? Dhritarashtra Uvacha. Dhritarashtra said, who is Dhritarashtra? Local Dhritarashtra, stupid, blind king. Blind in the sense of metaphorically blind, because he was blinded by his delusive and dysfunctional love for his offspring. All 100 of them useless fellows. And then, this is what is talked about. And so why should we study the Gita? There is a pun. Dhritarashtra, when you resolve the compound, Dhritam Rashtram Yena. Rashtra means this whole Jagat. Dhritam, by whom this whole Jagat is held. Already Bhagavan has walked into the picture even before we start the verses of the Bhagavad Gita. You see, this is a covert prayer. Athato Brahma Jignasa, covert prayer. Atha, the Mangala Vachaka, the auspicious sounding word, the word of, the syllable that sounds auspicious. Om and Atha is already used. And then, there are many examples of this. Even Panini, the first grammar sutra. Because Panini, if he's writing sutras, imagine him writing a long prayer to the sutras. That kind of goes against the spirit of the sutras, which are supposed to be pithy, short, and cleverly crafted, and having universal applicability. So, Vriddhi Radhaich. Vriddhi in the colloquial Sanskrit means may there be progress, growth. But actually Vriddhi is the name he gives to the strengthening of vowels. But here it is again a double entendre, double meaning. Vriddhi me syat. For this book, for me, let there be progress, let people read this, let this book survive. And by God, the prayer has worked. We are still studying Panini, the sutras. Maybe few people, but still it is well known. And if you Google Panini, and if you Google yourself, Panini will win, definitely. Okay, so this he is well known, and the sutras are well known. The prayer has worked. And so this prayer that we will be chanting every day before we do this is in the form of the same couplet, same meter as the rest of the Panchadashi. So let us chant it and begin the text. Namah Shri Shankarananda Guru Padambu Janmane Savilasa Mahamoha Graha Grasaika Karmane Namah Shri Shankarananda Guru Padambu Janmane Savilasa Mahamoha Graha Grasaika Karmane. Just seeing the long string of letters, and in fact the first line is 2 words and the second line is 1 word. Okay, and so you can see how artistic Swami Vidyaranya is, and the deep grasp of the language and the knowledge both are shown off. So it starts with the word Namaha, salutations, surrender. Unto whom? Unto Shankara. Adi Shankara we can take, or Bhagavan Shiva in the form of the Adi Guru, Lord Dakshinamurti. We can take that as well. So, Namah Shri Shankarananda. Namaha to Bhagavan Shankara, or the Guru called Shankara, who is at once, simultaneously, Ananda Swarupa. Seeing him makes everyone delighted because of who he is. The Guru is an embodiment of Ananda. Has to be, because otherwise how is this teaching taught? The teacher has to have some kind of a space, some inner space that the teacher enjoys to model this knowledge. And if the teacher keeps on weeping and says, I am Ananda, the Upanishad says, you are also Ananda, then it is very difficult to assimilate the knowledge if the teacher is complaining all the time. And so here, salutations to Shankara, who is the embodiment of Ananda. What this Ananda is, we'll have a long discussion of that. So right now, who is the embodiment of limitless joy, and who is the Guru, and then he is saying Namaskar to Shankarananda, the Guru, to the Gurus, not just the Guru, but the lotus feet of the Guru. Ambu Janman means, it's a neuter noun. Ambu Janman. Ambu, water. Janma, birth. Ambu Janman means the one who has birth in water. Oh, the feet are born in water. Feet are not born in water. Lotuses are born in water. Okay. And the lotuses are likened to the feet. Why are the feet likened to the lotuses? Well, this is the Shraddha and the Bhakti of the student. In place of the feet, one sees lotuses. And why? Because the lotus flower is seen as the quintessential metaphor of a jnani, a symbol of purity. A symbol of purity. Why? because for two reasons. One is because you throw anything at the lotus, some sludge, etc. It just both the lotus petals and the pad, the leaves, repel any kind of dirt. So too the jnani, growing in sludge of samsara, living amongst all the difficulties, dvandva, dualities, and all the discomfort, shines with saintliness, compassion, clarity, unaffected as it were by everything that surrounds the person. So the feet are likened to lotuses because the feet are the foundation of knowledge, and the feet of the jnani don't pick up any kind of subjectivity of samsara, the jnani is not affected by the pains and sorrows of the jagat. The jnani is insulated by the jnanam, which gives a kind of a Teflon consistency, a non-stick consistency to things that bother in the jagat, all the way from in-laws to outlaws, all the things that bother. This is like a Teflon. The jnani is like a Teflon, non-stick, repelling difficulties. So this is the first reason the lotus metaphor is very important. And again and again it is reused, overused, but it is still fresh because there is no other metaphor to describe the jnani. So how did this jnani become lotus-like? The second reason why the lotus metaphor is very popular in the Shastra is because the lotus is a flower that blooms by sunlight. You see it in the early morning before the sun is really out. It is it's like a bud. And as the sun comes up, so too it opens. It opens. Then at sunset, it just closes back. But for us, the rise of the sun and the opening of the lotus is itself enough for the poets to wax eloquent, to draw the comparison of the lotus-like heart, which is tightly closed due to raga and dvesha, which will not blossom, which is like a wooden lotus or a stone lotus or a clay lotus as described by Narahari in the Bodhasara. But the lotus flower, when exposed to sun, blooms. Not the clay flower, which is a lotus flower crafted out of clay or stone or wood. So the adhikaritvam, the qualifications that a student must have in order to bloom when exposed to the sun of Atma Vidya, sun of knowledge, blesses the student in the form of a lotus who has the potential to blossom and be fragrant and spread the fragrance from the standpoint of the Guru Parampara, share that fragrance from generation to generation, is very clear here, this metaphor. And so for that student to bloom, the heart must be in the right place, and then the blessed by the sun of knowledge, handled by the teacher, the heart blossoms. And so here we are looking at the lotus feet, which are the carriers of this tradition, and we relate to the feet of the teachers because it keeps us in a position of what is that called? Prahvi bhava. Prahvi bhava means a position of surrender. where the ahankara is placed at the lotus feet, so that there is a chance for it to be transformed through the study. And so here the author of the Panchadashi, Swami Vidyaranya, invokes the lotus feet of the teacher and says Namaha to the lotus feet of the Guru. Salutations to the lotus feet of the Guru. So what does the Guru do? Well, Guru does many things. Guru teaches, Guru eats, Guru drinks, Guru runs ashrams perhaps, and then Guru travels, all these things. But here, in the eyes of Swami Vidyaranya, his Guru has one and only job. It's a one job Guru. It's the only job Guru. And what is the job? So that's why it is called, the Guru is called Eka Karman. So, Eka Karmane Namaha Padambu Janmane Namaha. Fourth case. Namaha always takes the fourth case. And so here, Eka Karmane Namaha. So, Namaha to the lotus feet of the Guru, who has, and if you're talking of feet, they who have the feet have only one job. The Guru has only one job. And what is that one job? To be a shark. Oh no, from a lovely lotus, blossoming lotus. Now we go straight to alligators and sharks, big biting things. Yes. So the Guru has only one job, to be the alligator of Atma Ajnanam, to be the shark, graha. It's not clear what this graha means, because it means many things. Anything that catches and bites is called graha, from grah to grasp. So graha is shark, graha is alligator. So to this Guru, who is Bhagavan, and whose lotus feet are filled with the fragrance of Brahma Vidya, unto this Guru my salutations. And who is this Guru? Let me introduce you, my Guru. Suddenly, my Guru has turned into an alligator, a snapping alligator that goes after my self-ignorance. That's the only job of the Guru. The Guru doesn't have to mother the student, father the student, and take care of the student. No. The Guru goes after the self-ignorance with the persistence and the patience of a shark or an alligator. Graha, grasa means bite, that which eats, which destroys what? Self-ignorance. Savilasa Mahamoha, which destroys the self-ignorance along with the effect. In the form of delusion, in the form of samsara, etc. It destroys. Or we can take it that the alligator is the self-ignorance which the knowledge destroys. Destroys the alligator or the shark of self-ignorance, or the shark of the shark in the form of the Guru eats up self-ignorance. And then, so this is the meaning of, very beautiful. So you can, this is a wonderful introduction to what we are going to study. You can understand the caliber and the profundity of Swami Vidyaranya, who is extremely skilled in presenting this knowledge in a way that is easily assimilable. And so, then we'll chant the first verse and then look at where it leads us. Athatra Vishayanandaha Brahmanandamsha Rupa Bhak. Athatra Vishayanandaha Brahmanandamsha Rupa Bhak. Nirupyate Dvara Bhutastam द्वारभूतः निरूप्यते द्वारभूतः तदंशत्वं श्रुतिर्जगौ तदंशत्वं श्रुतिर्जगौ अथात्र विषयानन्दः ब्रह्मानन्दांशरूपभाक् अथात्र विषयानन्दः ब्रह्मानन्दांशरूपभाक् निरूप्यते द्वारभूतः तदंशत्वं श्रुतिर्जगौ. Already it is like Swami Vidyaranya's first verses of every chapter. It is so laden that we need a whole introduction to the first verse itself. In every chapter he does that. Sometimes you have to find you have to have a background even before we understand big words. Brahmananda, Vishayananda, what other big words are they? Dvarabhutaha, and all these things, these big concepts and words, because he is assuming, he doesn't condescend to his audience, and he assumes that people have been studying and reading, and he starts off with a big bang. Every chapter is like that. The verse is very, very pregnant with concepts that are going to be delineated over the course of the chapter. And so here also the term Vishayananda is used. Ananda, which is sometimes, there is a kind of a what is that called, translation, which is bliss. Especially when we talk about Brahman, it is translated as bliss, often with a capital B. B for bliss. And then this is rife with a lot of misunderstandings that are there in Vedantic circles. And the first misunderstanding of this Ananda is that it is something above and beyond the reach of everyone. It is beyond the reach of everybody. It is something which is very different. So it is different from what? From the rest of the kind of enjoyments that we have in the world. There is ice cream bliss, and then there is Brahman bliss. Don't confuse the two. Brahman bliss cannot be the same as ice cream bliss. Why? In fact, there is one ice cream that I was introduced to in Eugene. It is called bliss, coconut bliss. So this between coconut bliss and Brahman bliss, how can you compare? Ice cream finite, and coconut bliss is some kind of vegan ice cream, I suppose, made with coconut milk rather than regular milk. And so this coconut bliss and Brahman bliss, how can you compare in the same breath? Coconut bliss finite. That's why it comes in small tubs, so that you don't end up in the hospital after eating it. Okay, it comes in a small tub, and then after you eat it, then the bliss is gone. The tub is still there to weep into because it is gone. This is coconut bliss. How can you, even the big authors of Vedanta, even teachers, they talk like this. How can you compare it with Brahman bliss? That is everlasting. That is something. And so you cannot use the same word. That's why Ananda is translated as bliss, and coconut bliss, small b, Brahmananda, big B, B for bliss. This is something which has contributed to our misunderstanding. It has contributed very badly to our misunderstanding, and so therefore one keeps searching for this bliss. Oh, where are you, capital B? Come. And it is seen as something elusive. Suddenly this bliss comes. Suddenly it blesses. or it blisses you out, or blesses you out, something it does. And then the second misunderstanding that is there, a misapprehension, is that it is experiential. Coconut bliss is also experiential. Ice cream bliss, experiential. Chocolate cake bliss, experiential. What else? Movie bliss, experiential. Mall bliss, experiential. I don't know what bliss is there in the mall. Especially, I have changed the spelling of mall. MAUL is the new spelling, where you go to be mauled of your sanity and your pocketbook combined. But still, some people like it. So, mall bliss. And then having a cup of tea with a friend, bliss. Pakoda bliss, because when you think of tea, you think of pakodas. Pakoda bliss, this bliss, that bliss, and then no, don't compare it to the incomparable Brahman bliss with a capital B. So, that is also experiential. This is also experiential. Then what is the difference? Well, Brahman bliss is just amazing. I've heard people talk like this. It comes from the chakra in the head, and the bliss drips to the throat, to the back of the throat, which is so sweet and fragrant, and you keep experiencing it. This is exactly what I heard somebody say. And then I thought, that which drips from the back of the throat, from the head, it's something, it's cerebral fluid. This is seen as dangerous if you're tasting cerebral fluid from the back of the head in the throat. Please go to the hospital, don't wait, call 911. This is scary. But people talk about this like this. And some drops will come. If the drops keep coming, even if it is where will the drops be generated? It's coming out of the body, mind, sense complex. Won't one be dehydrated after taking on this bliss? So many questions I had. No. Those who talk don't know. This is another thing that is said about the bliss, quote unquote bliss. Those who talk don't know. And those who know don't talk. I say to the latter, Namo Namaha, wonderful, don't talk, because you don't know what you're talking about. Even this one, Vidyaranya Swamiji will say that. Vidyaranya Swami will also say that. You don't know what you're talking about. So better not to talk. And therefore, these misapprehensions, first of all, that it is experiential, and the experience of this bliss is different from the experience of small happinesses that one enjoys in one's life, derived from creature comforts, derived from seeing something that one loves, derived from seeing a blooming garden, a smile of a small child, a sunrise, a sunset, anything. This is something very different. The problem with this thought or with this stream of thinking is that it divides this Ananda into Ananda with a small a and Ananda with a capital A, exposing this knowledge to the contention that this is duality. Rightly so. Because if we are making this distinction between the kinds of Ananda, and Brahmananda is infinite and your Ananda is just bought with a few dollars, in the shop, in the freezer aisle of the supermarket where coconut bliss is available. And so therefore this Ananda is not as good as that Ananda, and that Ananda is what needs to be experienced, and this Ananda is of no use. This is a very, very dangerous proposition, where we have what is called in Sanskrit Advaita Hani. Hani means loss. Loss of Advaita. Now where is Advaita here? Where is non-duality? If already I am making a very strict and overt distinction between the Ananda that I daily experience and the Ananda that I see as belonging to Brahman, that is out of reach somehow and is bestowed to a select few suddenly, then this is a very, very big problem. And therefore, this chapter is very justified, because the entire chapter is devoted to Khandanam, a critique of this wrong view. A critique. Because if this bliss were different, if the quote unquote bliss of Brahman were different from the bliss of objects, so to speak, bliss is always within quotes, okay? If the bliss of Brahman, quote unquote, is different from the quote unquote bliss of objects, then we are in great trouble. It raises a lot of questions. Many, many questions are raised. Least of all, and we can just list them. Least of all, the first question: how do I know that Brahman bliss exists if I have never experienced it? A very important question. If we look closely, we see a very important fact. What is that? You can never desire anything that you do not know. Yeah, but I have a desire for heaven. You do know of heaven because it is there in all the scriptures. It is there in the Veda, it is there in the Bible, it is there in the Quran, it is there. Some kind of an afterlife which is described variously. In the Vedic heaven, for example, it says it's a place where you go and you leave behind all your core issues. In other words, you never have a bad day. Nobody can tick you off. Aha, very nice, wonderful. So this is one of the descriptions of the Hindu version of heaven. And the Christian version also has similar thing. The lion and the lamb are sitting together, meaning the predator and prey are sitting side by side without the predator wanting to polish off the prey and have Advaita experience with the prey. No, not at all. If they are sitting side by side peacefully, this is what is talked about. And so you do know heaven. Heaven is not totally unknown. My question for you is that, can you desire an unknown thing that you have never heard of, that you have never even understood? The answer obviously is no. You can only desire something that you know. Something that you know. And here, Brahmananda is object of desire, which is the problem, but that we will see later. Everyone wants happiness to be there always. One is not satisfied with happiness that is finite. Therefore, any happy thing that happens, the question asked is it permanent? Oh, I just moved into a new house. Oh, does it belong to you? Did you buy it? Well, yes. Oh, congratulations. Means it is yours. Actually, it belongs to the bank, For the next 35 years, it belongs to the bank. It doesn't belong to you. The piece of paper stating ownership is with the bank, and you might as well be paying rent. That's all it is. And so, this is how people ask. And in India, if somebody says, I got a job, is it permanent? No, I'm on probation for 6 months. After that, it may become permanent. This permanence is associated with this Ananda. Very interesting. And this permanence, not being centered on objects, gives rise to the conclusion that this permanence, which must belong to Brahman, and this Brahman is something which has to be experienced. And once you get hold of this Brahman, you have a permanent experience of this Ananda. So if this is the case, see, these are all the questions that come out of the wrong understanding. So there seems to be this notion of forever, and that forever is also connected to another concept, real. This is in colloquial language. Is it real? Permanent means real. And that's how companies like Coca-Cola can just capitalize on this connection between permanence and real. And that's why they say, have the real thing. What is the real thing? Coca-Cola. It is the real thing. Everybody seems to want the real thing. And the real thing is connected to and if you ask somebody what is real, that which is lasting is seen as real. And that which is lasting is seen as an important pursuit. This is what needs to be pursued. A very important pursuit. So, when we say Brahmananda, these are the implied meanings, implied associations. From what? From one's own experience as a jiva struggling for happiness. Therefore, the happiness from objects, derived from objects, cannot be different, and this is the contention of Swami Vidyaranya, cannot be different from the happiness that is connected to the subject. Happiness centered on objects is called Vishayananda in this chapter. Vishaya, object. And then Vishayanam Anandaha, Vishayanandaha, the Ananda associated with or derived from objects. Ananda connected to objects. This is not different from Swarupananda, the Ananda, the happiness associated with one's nature. It cannot be. You cannot say, I want everlasting happiness and I want to experience it. Not possible. Because who is saying this? The one who is already happy is saying this. Because of self-ignorance, there is this divide between the experiencer, one divide. So there is a person called experiencer, the ahankara with the status of bhokta, experiencer. Then there is objects of experience, vishaya, and then what? And then the means of experiencing, which are the sense organs, etc., or even inference, like certain branches of knowledge are experienced through certain inferences, which makes the scientists very, very happy because they have made this discovery. So the means of knowledge, primarily the sense organs. So now we have a Ananda that is divided, so to speak, as though divided. So we have a triad of Ananda. Three things are required to experience this Ananda. First, there should be me. The experiencer should be there. And second, what should be there? That which I desire to experience, the object should be there. Me, the subject, the one that is wanting to become a bhokta, an experiencer. So the potential experiencer and the potential object of experience. And then third one, the mode or the manner of experience. That also should be there. What is the mode of experience? Are you seeing something that is making you happy? Are you hearing something that is making you delighted? Are you eating something? Are you touching a petal of a flower that is so soft that cannot be reproduced. Touching a petal of a flower is like touching Ishvara. Really, so beautiful. And so, what is it that you are, that you are experiencing, through which manner or mode the sense organs, the means of experience, in Sanskrit called pramana. So we have the means of experience, bhoga pramana, and then we have bhokta, experiencer, and then we have the bhogya, the objects of experience. This is a threefold divide, which is why one is left wanting, because as we will see in the verses that follow, the experiencer and the fusion of experiencer and experienced gives birth to this joy that one wants to experience. The fusion of subject, object, or even the contact of object and subject is needed in order to have this experience of what we call joy. And it is by nature finite. Why? When it is centered on objects. How? Because how long can this contact last? The contact is dependent upon the state of mind of the experiencer, the availability of the object. So many things have to line up. It's not really easy. So many things have to completely line up, one after one after one, for the contact to take place between the object and the subject. You give their favorite food, some kind of wonderful 5-course dinner you make for somebody. You invite them, and then what? They don't want to eat. Why? Stomach upset. You have cooked all their delicacies, delectable, delicious dishes you have made just for them. They come with a wry expression on their face, and they say, I really didn't want to stay away. I'm here. I want to be with you. But alas, I'm having some kind of stomach distress. I cannot even look at what you have made, much less eat it. You see? Not easy. Or you again, another scenario, you have made this delicious dinner and the friend comes over, the friend is hungry also. Just before sitting down to eat, the friend gets a text message. Some beloved one passed away, unfortunately. And then what? The whole appetite is gone. The desire to be the experiencer gone. So, you see, so many things have to line up. So many things have to line up. Or the object is not available. As it happened to me once. Somebody, when I first went to America, somebody said, please come to our house for dinner. And then I went. And then I was very excited. I had heard a lot about their cooking. And then they were gourmet cooks. And so I went. And then I had to take one bus and then change and take another bus. It was a complicated affair. And by the time I went there, I was hungrier than when I started. And then I went and knocked on the door. Nobody home. Pun intended, nobody home. And then no one home. Knocked, went around the house, nobody home. All the lights were off. And then I took another 2 buses and came back. And then next day or 2-3 days later, I happened to run into them. And then I said, what happened? Oh, we forgot. We forgot that we had invited you. So you see, I could have gone with a great appetite and a wonderful mood for enjoying the objects of delight from the standpoint of the cooking. but the experiencer was left high and dry because the objects of enjoyment were not available. See, so many things have to come, to pass. So many things have to align. It's easier for the stars to align themselves and bless you rather than the object, subject, and the mode of experience to align. One more scenario, okay? And another scenario is that the subject is present, the object is present, subject is in a good mood, object is available, and then what? The mode of experiencing is vitiated. And here we can take a contemporary example of someone afflicted with COVID. What happens? What are one of the symptoms? Loss of taste, loss of smell. So the means of experience are vitiated. They cannot enjoy what is cooked. Why? Because there is the means of experience are somehow inhibited, affected, afflicted, so that they are not able to enjoy. So the mode of enjoyment is not there. Then also there is this impairment. You might as well feed such a person pieces of cardboard. It's the same thing. The food is tasting like cardboard. So you see, the subject object to align, subject object, and what is in between? The mode of experiencing the object, which connects the experiencer to the object of experience. All these things have to line up for there to be Vishayananda. The birth of Vishayananda is contingent upon all these three factors lining up. So difficult, very difficult. That's why in life one feels that this happiness is elusive. Where are you, oh Lord? Why aren't you blessing me? Why can't I get happy? Then the happiness seems to come, and then before you understand it and can enjoy it, it is gone. Like the story that I have told you many times. And I saw this child, at some retreat that I was teaching. I saw this child in an ashram crying into her ice cream. And because of her tears, the ice cream was melting faster and faster. And she had a small little cup of ice cream and she was weeping into it. I said, what happened? She's eating and weeping. And she said, it's half is gone and now the whole thing will go very soon. She was weeping in advance. Very clever child. She knew the end of this. She knew what it was going to look like. She knew that her mother is not going to allow her to have another cup. This was all she was allowed, and then half of it is already over, so I cannot even enjoy it. This is the condition of everyone. And even before the subject object align themselves, the prospect that this is finite is extremely bothersome. And it is not only bothersome, it is something which is intolerable. And here we need to spend a little more time on why it is intolerable. It is intolerable because somewhere, somehow, one knows that this happiness that is called Brahmananda or Swarupananda, centered on the subject, is there somewhere and I am entitled to it. So one knows. One knows somehow, without a shadow of doubt, without even flipping through paperback Vedanta in airports and other places, without or any self-help books. how to, how to do this, how to be happy, what is that called? How to have friends and influence people. I am okay, you are okay. These, without even reading these kinds of books. I am Ananda, you are Ananda. One knows. In fact, everyone is an armchair philosopher, because one says that this is your real self, and there is some kind of a gap between your real self and the self that is experienced every day. A self that is experienced every day through the experience of objects. A self that is referential, meaning it is a self that is a relational self. What I am in touch with seems to be a self that relates to everything and then comes back singed, scathed, and afflicted by those relationships. But the desire for a self that is unaffected by all this, and all this means all the world of objects and their power over me, that self I want to be. And if you don't know that self, my question for you is this. Swami Vidyaranya's question for you is also this in the Panchadashi. How come you desire it? If this Swarupananda is completely unknown, it cannot be an entity that you desire. If it is known, then you know how to go about to getting it. Then also it is not something that you keep longing for. So what is this Swarupananda? This Swarupananda is already known. How is it known? Go to sleep. Simple. Not right now, okay? Yeah. Although Vedanta classes are very, very alluring for one to go into Swarupananda, Nirvikalpa Samadhi, because what you hear is relaxing. So, Swarupananda is something that is known. How is it known? It is primarily known in what is called sleep state or sleep experience. In sleep, the duality or the triad of experiencer, object of experience, and the mode of experience all are obfuscated, eliminated. What is there is you, without even the status of an experiencer, because you are not experiencing anything in particular that is outside of you. You simply are, without complaints, without inhibitions, without encumbrances, without limitations. You simply are. That is why sleep is much coveted by all, because in sleep we have an uninhibited experience of Brahmananda. And even when I say experience of, it is a Aupachariki Shashti, the sixth case use. Experience of is just a metaphorical usage. So the sleep is an experience which is Brahman, unmitigated by objects. Because in sleep, one is neither the relator nor has the world of objects to relate to. Both are absent. The status of the relator, the status of the experiencer, absent. Mode of experience, absent. Because you can put a piece of chocolate cake underneath the nostrils of a sleeping person, they will continue to sleep. And so the mode of experiencing have gone into a causal state. Experiencer is present, but in a causal state. The status of experiencer is not there. And then the objects of experience are also not there, yet there is happiness in sleep that is cognized in hindsight when the mind stretches and wakes up and has its cup of coffee. When the mind wakes up, it says, aha, what a nice sleep. Sukham aham aswapsam nakinchid avedisham. A fanciful way of saying, I was fast asleep so happily and I did not know anything. And in this not knowing anything, that is the key, because there is no, the sleep becomes an important example to cut through the myth of object-based happiness, of that hankering after object-based happiness is the way to become happy, quote unquote become, okay. It cuts through these myths, because what are you relating to in sleep? Nothing. You're not relating to anything in sleep, you're not relating to anybody in sleep, yet it is so happy. How can you say it is happy? Because you don't want to wake up. Simple. That's why every alarm has a snooze button. Because you want to keep on sleeping, keep on sleeping, keep on sleeping. You want to keep on sleeping. I think somebody needs to be muted. Can you please mute everyone? Yeah. So keep on sleeping. One has to keep on sleeping, and then this is the desire to continue with this. One is loath to awaken, happy to have sleep, and in sleep the ananda is unimpaired by the quality or the mode of mind of the experiencer, uninhibited by the availability or non-availability of the objects of experience, and the impairment or the unimpairment of the mode of experience, sense organs, etc. This is one, that is why the sleep example is very, very important. The only problem with this ananda of sleep, Swarupananda in sleep, is that it is only cognized in hindsight, which again leads one to think that this Swarupananda must be very, very elusive. Not quite. Even during the waking state, despite all of one's complaints, despite all of one's problems, one is able to be happy. One is able to be free of all the things that surround one. Like I said, there are many factors that go into this clearing. First factor is that suddenly one day one has a grip on one's raga and dvesha. One is able to suspend the raga and dvesha. One is able to be in a place that is unencumbered by the different states of mind, and one is able to just be happy, as the lay people would describe it, for no particular reason. For no particular reason, one wakes up and finds oneself a non-demanding, appreciative being, compassionate, accommodative being. And on such days, in such moments, even if someone ticks you off, you say, it's okay. I understand, you must be having a difficult day. Chalo, it's okay, chhod diya, I've let you go. I'm not going to spoil my day over this. You said something you shouldn't have. You did something you should not have. But we are all fallible, and there is that accommodation is there. And there is a audarya, there is a kind of a exaltation in one. One is compassionate, one is kind, one is able to reach out. Despite one's difficulties, one is able to reach out. And this is, these these kinds of experiences, even though they may be few and far between, serve a very important purpose of making us aware that there is such a thing called Swarupananda. I can be like this all the time. I don't need to depend on anything for my well being. So, this Ananda has nothing to do with objects. It is centered on me. Because on the days when I'm not complaining, when I have the spirit of accommodation, then even though the objects of love are not there, I'm still okay. Regardless of whether they are there or not there, I'm still okay. Even if somebody ticks me off, I am okay. And you know what? Not just the individual being, but even on the level of the corporate world also knows this, that your nature is Ananda. For example, pharmaceutical companies. That is why the pharmaceutical companies are busy keeping on discovering newer and newer antidepressants, newer and newer anti-anxiety medication. Why? Because even the pharmaceutical companies know you are Ananda. Depression is an interloper, it has to be removed. Chemically, it can be removed. Very interesting. Pharmaceutical companies also know that anxiety is an interloper, even though they have not studied Vedanta at all. They don't know V for Vedanta. But still they know. They know that this doesn't belong. The person is different from the depression. The person is different from the anxiety. In fact, in the natural state, Swarupa of the person is all peace, joy, etc. Somehow this understanding is there. It is like discovering in your attic or in your, in your some attic of your parents. They have left something for you, and you discover a really dull pot which is blackened, dark, and covered with tarnish. You are about to throw it away because you say, what is this? Tin pot, lead pot, this is not, I don't need this. I'm just going to give it to goodwill. You are about to put it in the goodwill box, something prevails and you take another look at it. When you take another look at it, you see a small chink in this tarnish, a bright piece, shining metal, copper. A little piece shines through despite itself, like the jiva submerged in miserable experiences and difficulties. Still this Ananda shines through, which becomes an important place, an important thing to catch hold of. This is why we don't give up on this self, no matter how miserable it is. We don't give up on this self because it is like a little chink of luminescence that shows through this pot full of tarnish. All it needs is a tamarind bath. You put it in tamarind or some kind of a cleansing agent, and you remove the patina, this veneer, and you see that not just this little portion, but the whole pot is shining, lustrous, like even the eye, which shines the self-evident, Satchidananda's self, that is somewhat known, but mostly misunderstood. And how to correct this understanding is talked about in this chapter, which we will pick up in the next class. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om. Thank you.